In the opening chapters of Genesis, the name Enoch appears only briefly, almost as if the biblical narrative pauses for a moment before continuing the long genealogy that stretches from Adam toward the story of Noah and the coming flood. Yet the line describing him has puzzled readers for centuries because it ends in a way that no other early patriarch's story ends. The text simply says that Enoch walked with God, and then he was no more, because God took him. That single statement has raised quiet curiosity among scholars, theologians, and readers who notice that something unusual seems to be implied within those few ancient words preserved in the Hebrew text. Unlike the other figures listed in that genealogy, Enoch is not described as dying. Instead, the narrative abruptly suggests a departure that seems mysterious, even within the broader context of the biblical story. For ancient readers, that difference mattered. In a tradition where genealogies carefully recorded births, years lived, and deaths, the absence of death in Enoch's story stood out immediately. It hinted that his life ended in a way that was remembered as extraordinary. Centuries later, during the period known today as the Second Temple era, Jewish writers began expanding upon that brief biblical reference, exploring the possibility that Enoch's departure involved an encounter with the heavenly realm. These writings did not appear in the canonical Hebrew Bible, but they circulated widely among Jewish communities during the centuries before the time of Jesus. Among those texts, the most famous is what modern readers call the Book of Enoch. Rather than presenting Enoch as simply a righteous man who disappeared, this ancient work describes him as someone taken on a journey beyond the ordinary human world. According to the narrative preserved in those writings, Enoch was shown visions of the heavens, the structure of the cosmos, and the moral order that governed the universe. He was guided through realms that ancient people imagined existing beyond the visible sky. Mountains of fire, rivers of light, and vast celestial chambers appear throughout the descriptions contained in those texts. Whether understood symbolically or literally, the imagery reveals how ancient writers attempted to describe realities they believed existed beyond human sight. For the communities who preserved the Book of Enoch, these visions were not merely stories meant to entertain. They were attempts to explain how the world functioned beneath its visible surface. The text explores questions about justice, judgment, and the hidden forces shaping human history. And within those passages, Enoch appears not only as an observer, but also as a messenger. He is shown events unfolding across time, and then instructed to record what he witnessed. In this sense, the Book of Enoch belongs to a broader category of ancient literature known as apocalyptic writings. These texts sought to reveal hidden structures behind historical events, often presenting their insights through visions, symbolic imagery, and journeys beyond the earthly realm. Such writings were surprisingly common in the centuries surrounding the birth of Christianity. Fragments of the Book of Enoch were even discovered among the Dead Sea Scrolls in the caves of Qumran, showing that the text was known and copied by Jewish communities more than 2,000 years ago. That discovery confirmed that the Enoch tradition was not a later medieval invention, but part of a much older literary world connected to early Judaism. What makes the Book of Enoch particularly intriguing is how frequently it was referenced by early religious thinkers. Several early Christian writers were familiar with it. Some quoted passages from it when discussing angels, judgment, and the unseen dimensions of reality. Even the New Testament letter of Jude contains a line that closely resembles a passage from Enoch's writings. This does not mean that the Book of Enoch was universally accepted as scripture. Different Jewish and Christian communities debated which texts belonged within their sacred collections. Over time, the canon of the Hebrew Bible and the New Testament became more clearly defined. Many writings once read alongside biblical texts gradually faded from regular use. The Book of Enoch was one of those writings, yet its influence never completely disappeared. In Ethiopia, the text remained part of the biblical tradition for centuries, preserved in the Ethiopian Orthodox Church long after it had vanished from most Western collections. Meanwhile, historians and theologians continued studying its themes to better understand the intellectual world of ancient Judaism. Because even if the Book of Enoch did not become part of the standard biblical canon in most traditions, it still reveals something important. It shows how ancient readers interpreted the brief biblical reference to a man who walked with God and then vanished from the earth. For them, that short line in Genesis opened the door to a far larger story. A story about heavenly journeys, cosmic visions, and a figure who was believed to have witnessed realities far beyond the boundaries of ordinary human life. And that raises a fascinating question that many modern readers rarely consider. If the biblical text left only a single mysterious sentence about Enoch, why did ancient writers feel compelled to expand his story so dramatically? What was it about that brief reference that inspired generations to imagine that Enoch had seen something the rest of humanity had not? As the traditions surrounding Enoch continued to circulate through ancient Jewish communities, the figure of this mysterious patriarch gradually became associated with something even more intriguing than a simple heavenly journey. He became connected to knowledge. In the Book of Enoch, the visions shown to him are not random spectacles meant only to impress the reader. They are explanations about how the universe is structured, how justice is measured, and how actions on earth are believed to echo within a larger cosmic order. Enoch is portrayed as someone who observes these structures carefully and records them. In many ways, the text presents him almost like an ancient witness, someone who was allowed to see beyond the limits normally placed upon human perception. Among the most discussed passages in the Book of Enoch are those describing a group known as the Watchers. According to the narrative, these beings were angels assigned to observe humanity, but the text claims that some of them chose to descend to Earth and interact directly with the human world. The story describes them sharing knowledge with people, knowledge about metalworking, weapon crafting, cosmetics, and astronomical observation. These descriptions have fascinated readers because they appear to portray a sudden expansion of human knowledge. Ancient authors seem to be wrestling with a question that still intrigues historians today. How did early civilizations develop complex skills so quickly in certain regions of the ancient world? Of course, modern historians explain such developments through gradual cultural exchange, technological experimentation, and the accumulation of practical knowledge over generations. But ancient writers did not always frame these developments in that way. Instead, they sometimes explain sudden advances by imagining the involvement of supernatural teachers. Within the Book of Enoch, the Watchers become symbols of that idea, beings who crossed a boundary that was not meant to be crossed, and in doing so, altered the course of human history. Whether one interprets that narrative symbolically or historically, it reflects something deeply human. The desire to understand where knowledge comes from, why certain discoveries appear at particular moments, and how societies interpret the origins of their most powerful tools. The Book of Enoch answers those questions through mythic storytelling. Yet even mythic storytelling reveals the intellectual concerns of the people who created it. The text reflects a world where moral order, divine authority, and human responsibility were tightly connected. If knowledge was misused, it was believed to have consequences not only for individuals, but for entire civilizations. In this sense, the Book of Enoch becomes less about supernatural spectacle and more about ethical reflection. It asks whether humanity was ready to handle the power it had acquired. That theme appears repeatedly throughout the narrative, and it ultimately connects with the broader biblical story leading toward the flood described in Genesis. Ancient readers sometimes interpreted the flood as a moment when the world was reset after corruption had spread too far. The Book of Enoch places its own interpretation alongside that familiar account. It suggests that disorder began when boundaries between heaven and earth were broken. Whether one views that explanation as theology, allegory, or cultural myth, it reveals how ancient people tried to understand the moral direction of their world. But perhaps the most fascinating aspect of Enoch's story is how little the biblical text itself actually says. Genesis gives only that brief line about a man who walked with God and then was taken. Everything else comes from generations of interpretation built around that mystery. Some communities embraced those expanded stories. Others chose to focus only on the canonical text that became the Hebrew Bible. Over time, many Americans grew up hearing only the short Genesis reference without realizing that an entire body of ancient literature once explored the meaning behind it. Today, scholars continue studying the Book of Enoch not as hidden scripture, but as an important historical window into the beliefs of early Jewish communities. It helps historians understand how ancient people imagined the unseen world, how they wrestled with the origins of knowledge, and how they interpreted the mysterious figure of a man who seemed to vanish from the earth without experiencing death. The story of Enoch therefore remains intriguing, not because it provides definitive answers, but because it preserves the questions that ancient people asked. Questions about heaven, about knowledge, and about the boundaries between the human world and whatever might lie beyond it. And perhaps that is why the name Enoch continues to appear in discussions even today. Because within that single line of Genesis lies a mystery that generations have never stopped trying to understand.